Hi, in this unit we are going to be covering the topic of ecology. Now, the standards that Florida State wants you to know are listed here. They basically boil down to the movement of energy, cycling of matter, factors affecting population size, factors affecting the ecosystem, aquatic systems, and impacts on biodiversity due to catastrophic events such as, say, a meteor falling onto the planet or human activity. This particular lecture is going to be covering energy, food chains, and food webs. All life is dependent on energy. Now, this energy might come from the hydrothermal vents and deep in the Earth's ocean with chemoautotrophs. Most of the energy that is used on this planet comes from the sun, where sunlight is absorbed by plants to conduct photosynthesis, and that creates food. That plant is then eaten by a consumer, and then something eats that consumer, and so on and so forth in a long chain of life. So let us take a look at a simple food chain. Here you have the sun, which is, again is the source of energy, and then a plant absorbs that sunlight, uses it for photosynthesis to create food. That plant is then eaten by grasshopper. Grasshopper is eaten by a mouse. The mouse is consumed by a snake. The snake is eaten by a hawk, and then eventually the hawk will die. Well, the body's there, but as you know, usually what happens is the body decomposes and it breaks down. There are actually organisms that does that job of decomposition, including mushrooms, and they break down the body so that the nutrients will be available again. And sometimes some of that stuff is released into the soil and it is eaten by a detritivore. For example, this poor picture of an earthworm. Now, each of the organisms in this food chain has a particular job, and the job depends on what level they are, depending on what they eat. At the first level, you have the producers. They are the ones that aptly produce the food. They take the energy from the sun and they create food. Now, the ones that eat the producers, when we eat something, we consume it. So the first ones that eat, aptly named primary consumer. Then, of course, you have the secondary consumers, which eat the primary consumers, and the tertiary consumers, who eat the secondary, and the quaternary that eat the tertiary. And once the quaternary dies, as explained earlier, the decomposer comes along and breaks down the body. However, to be more accurate, it's not just the quaternary that is broken down by the decomposer, but anything that dies is going to be eventually broken down to recycle the nutrients, even the decomposer itself. And then, finally, we have the one that specializes in eating dead organic matter that is left in the soil, whether it's been decomposed or if it's just small fragments. Those are the detritivores. In reality, food and energy doesn't pass from organism to organism in a simple chain. It's actually a number of chains overlapping each other, interposed over each other, and it forms a complete web. So you can see how here the pica eats the producer, but it's eaten by multiple other organisms, which are then eaten by other organisms at the top. So at the bottom, again, you have the producers and decomposers. They produce the food and break down the nutrients from dead matter. And then these are eaten by the primary consumers at this level. And then the primary consumers are eaten by the secondary, and the secondary are eaten by the tertiary. Notice the way the arrows are pointing. They're always pointing in the direction that the energy is going. So you're going from producer to consumer, consumer to secondary, secondary to tertiary. One thing to note about this particular food web is if you look at the coyote, mountain lion, they are considered tertiary consumers. And if you look at the left, it goes from food, the producer to the pica, pica to the ringtail, ringtail to coyote. So producer to primary, primary to secondary, secondary to tertiary. However, if you look on the right side with a mule deer, you'll notice that the mule deer eats from the producers, therefore it is primary, but then skips the secondary consumer and gets eaten directly by the mountain lion coyote. In this case, you would consider it a secondary consumer, but because these two also eat secondary consumers on top of the primary consumer, it's considered a tertiary. So to consider what level it is, you go to the highest level that it can be, not the lowest level, which would be secondary in this case. Now let's practice identifying some of the trophic levels in these three sample ecosystems. In grassland, you have, of course, the grass, which is eaten by the grasshoppers. Grasshoppers eaten by the toads, eaten by the snakes, eaten by the hawk. So the grass would be the producer. Grasshoppers would be the primary consumer. Toads would be the secondary consumer. Snakes would be the tertiary consumer. Hawks would be the quaternary consumer. In river ecosystems, you have algae. They are the producers. They are the ones that photosynthesize. Algae is eaten by mayfly larvae. The mayfly larvae are eaten by juvenile trout. Juvenile trout are eaten by kingfishers. So the algae would be the producer. Mayfly larva would be the primary consumer since it's the one that eats the producer. Juvenile trout would be the secondary consumer, and kingfisher would be the tertiary consumer. Note, not all ecosystems have a quaternary consumer. In the marine ecosystem, as an example, you have diatoms, which are small photosynthetic organisms. They are plankton, which are eaten by copepods, other types of plankton. These are the animal plankton. These are the plant plankton or photosynthetic plankton. And then copepods are eaten by herring, type of fish, which are eaten by seals, and seals are eaten by great white sharks. So in this case, diatoms will be the producer, copepods would be the primary consumer, herring would be the secondary consumer, seals will be the tertiary, and great white sharks would be the quaternary consumer.